Happy to be here. Thanks to Kelly. She's organized this for a while now and has always been generous to reach out and ask me to participate. So it's always pleasure being back with the ACWM. Um, and nice to see some names I recognize in the little blocks all over my my screen. Um, so just to kick off, I've been interested in the Civil War for quite a long time. Ever since I was a young child, my family took a trip to Gettysburg when I was around 8 or so, which really, captivated my interests, as I'm sure it does for a lot of young children, and really propelled me to want to learn more about the war itself and some of the battles, some of the leaders, and key moments. I was fortunate enough to be able to study as an undergraduate at Gettysburg College, which is probably one of the best places for a young Civil War enthusiast to study. But it was really there that my interest in the Civil War deepened quite a bit. And really, I was trying to, or very interested in learning more about how people, just Northerners and Southerners, Unionists, Confederates, enslaved and free African Americans, really grappled with the war itself and the questions that came out of it. And I really find that there are many rich problems and rich questions that require some deep analysis that all Americans had to figure out and deal with after the war ended. And so I began graduate school at UVA, wanting to dig deeper into these questions of what the war's outcomes really meant for various groups of people and how both individually and collectively they understood the war and pushed for different visions of what the country would look like after the war ended. And so that's one question that's really at the heart of my dissertation project at UVA, kind of looking at military occupation and race in Virginia during the war and also in Reconstruction, and how Reconstruction unfolded in the state of Virginia, the state that really had been the epicenter of a lot of combat during the war. And so I'm particularly interested in what these federal occupying soldiers thought, how they viewed their role as occupiers, how individuals benefited from their presence, but also how those that were occupied viewed those occupying them. And my master's thesis, which forms a part of my dissertation and what I'll be speaking on tonight, really tried to get at this issue of the effectiveness of post-Civil War military occupation and what intersected with racial violence through an episode in Norfolk, which took place exactly 1 year and 1 week after the surrender at Appomattox. So on the morning of April 16th in 1866, African Americans in Norfolk, Virginia, gathered to celebrate the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which actually had been passed a week earlier on April 9th. And this act really declared that all people born in the United States were citizens of the country. And it really worked to kind of secure the outcomes of the war and set the nation on a course towards ratifying the 14th Amendment. And so this was cause for much celebration, and Norfolk's Black residents planned this very elaborate parade throughout the town. They were guided by recently discharged United States color troops, and they planned to march throughout Norfolk down the main streets to the northern part of town, where they had erected a speaker stand to discuss what the passing of this historic act meant for the future of African American people in the United States. Unfortunately, though, those intentions didn't pan out as they had planned, and what started as this very peaceful parade didn't end as one. White civilians in Norfolk lined the streets as the parade passed by, throwing bricks and bottles at the participants, hurling insults at them, and eventually gunfire rang out, which dispersed the crowd for the remainder of the day. But a few hours later, as dusk started to settle across Norfolk, a squad of between 80 and 100 white men, marching by twos and in cadence step, paraded down the main street. They were dressed in gray and described as looking prepared for battle, as they were spotted wielding pistols and rifles, banding and disbanding at will, cursing and damning the Negroes, and firing at any they saw. An African American resident of Norfolk remarked that he had, quote, a very bad opinion of the feeling here, more so now than before the surrender of the Confederate Army. So after this, violent night throughout Norfolk, the next day it became clear that 4 people had died and many more African Americans in particular were left wounded. The federal military presence in the city was eventually able to quell the disturbance and stop the violence from these of gray-clad men. Again, this is a year after Appomattox. But before the 1866 summer was over, major outbursts of racial violence plagued the South twice more. In the first days of May 1866, racial tension gripped the city of Memphis as another riot terrorized its Black population. And not long after that, New Orleans experienced its own violent episode, which was a lethal mob attack on a Republican parade in July. And so these 3 incidents, in my view, really demonstrate how people hoped for a peaceful reconstruction of this kind of seamless transition from slavery to citizenship to freedom for African Americans was really a distant hope at this time. So racial violence, is really not a new addition to the story of Reconstruction. And in the war's aftermath, once the Civil War ended, a big challenge for the Union Army and the Union federal government was how to incorporate the Southern states back into the national fold while also protecting the rights of the newly freed slaves. And while Confederate armies had surrendered and rebel soldiers began returning home, the United States government recognized the very real possibility that some of these Southerners, former Confederates, might actually continue fighting. And this fear really underscored the need for maintaining some Union soldiers in the field to oversee this transition from wartime to peacetime. So as hundreds of thousands of Northern men demobilized and they returned home, the number of federal troops in the South declined very drastically from about 1 million in April of 1865 to roughly 300,000 at the end of June of that same year. And the number continued to fall into 1866. So there were only about 30,000 troops, Union troops left in the South. One tension I tried to explore in my master's thesis, and hopefully in the dissertation project as well, is this impact and effectiveness of military occupation in the South. And some historians argue that the impact of it is largely dependent on what the war's goals were and when they were fulfilled and completed. So some of these major questions revolve around, did the war end in 1865 with Confederate? So does surrender equal end of war? Or on the other hand, did the federal government operate under a post-surrender wartime, as one historian calls it, until former Confederates acquiesced to congressional demands? So in that thread, military surrender was only one part of full surrender. Extending the timeline of the Civil War into the late 1860s and even into the early 1870s, which some historians have argued, which is when the last Confederate state was readmitted and seated in Congress, really allows us to view what we typically think of and call early Reconstruction as just an extension of the war itself. Since ex-Confederates maintained a fairly martial mentality in the years after surrender. And it increasingly became clear that only the presence of federal troops in the South would curb their violence. The growing chorus across the nation convinced Congress that accomplishing the war's goals of political reunion and racial equality relied heavily on the military's authority to run an occupation that would have been illegal in peacetime. And so the former Confederates could not be allowed to rule unimpeded because they certainly would refuse to acknowledge the rights of free blacks. And only the military's presence, therefore, could enforce the very still fragile civil rights. However, as other historians argue, this contrasted with what most Civil War Americans wished for and desired. And that was most Northerners didn't want the extent of radical change that the radical Republicans were really pushing for. And instead, most were content and happy to judge Reconstruction success on the primary aims of the war. So that was restoring the Union, abolishing slavery, and extinguishing any kind of further rebellion. So political reunion was the goal of the war, nothing else. And because of that, then military occupation was really unwanted, it was unnecessary, and the reduction of troops in the South after the war ended was needed, even if that military withdrawal took place at the expense of African Americans. So boiling that down, the differences in the direction the federal government desired Reconstruction to go and how civilians and soldiers in the occupying armies conceptualized in Reconstruction. And so these two differing opinions, differing thoughts, and courses of action really allowed former Confederates to exploit them through racial violence so they could push their own agenda and ensure that their voices were heard and Reconstruction would progress the way that they wanted. And so, with these two things in mind, I really kept finding that military occupation in Norfolk provided only tenuous protection for Blacks. And I was really struck by this event and how overshadowed it had become by other riots later in the summer. Those race riots that occurred in Memphis and New Orleans in May and July of 1866 are really seen as the two instances during presidential Reconstruction, 1865 to 67, that really infuriated radical Republicans over how President Johnson was handling Reconstruction and signaled that ex-Confederates just simply wouldn't fall back into line with the new racial order and accept all of this new civil rights legislation. And it was these two incidents, Memphis and New Orleans, that historians have asserted pushed Congress to take control of Reconstruction and rule with a heavy hand during the period known as military Reconstruction. And so that's certainly persuasive for sure. It is not really taking into account the context in which a lot of these riots happened. And military occupation and its influence on post-war racial violence seems to play a fairly minor role in explaining how and why these incidents happened, when they did and where they did. And Black political activism also seems to play a rather small role as well, or at least smaller than I find satisfying. So Norfolk then is a place where a lot of things came together, a lot of factors. Military occupation, which the city had been under since 1862 and continued throughout Reconstruction. There was an active Black political community, which had been pressing for rights even before Robert E. Lee's surrender. Returning Confederates who lived in the area, and a major federal military installation practically right next door, Fortress Monroe. So Norfolk then can really shed light on how federal demobilization in the midst of all these things created opportunities for ex-Confederates to really form insurgencies and violently lash out at Blacks and their Unionist counterparts to try to preempt further social and racial change. And the incredibly active African American population in Norfolk took a lead in promoting Black rights after the passage of the 13th Amendment. The congressional override and then the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was therefore a very natural cause for celebration for the African American population in Norfolk, who again embarked on this fairly elaborate parade throughout the town. And the white civilians, the white citizens, vehemently objected to this and made their displeasure at sharing their public space with African Americans known, again, as they threw bottles and bricks into the parade crowd and later marched throughout town wearing their Confederate uniforms in large groups. So in May of 1866, Ulysses S. Grant ordered investigation into this incident, this riot, and a board of officers was tasked with the inquiry and interviewed about 67 individuals to learn what happened, the course of events, and then were to report their findings back to the Department of Virginia headquarters in Richmond. And the congressional inquiry eventually concluded that the celebratory parade had inflamed the sentiments of the white citizens in Norfolk and really exposed their hostile stance towards Black rights and celebrations of them. Some even went so far as to claim that January 1st, the Emancipation Proclamation anniversary, was the only day for celebration for African Americans, stating that that day was one they already had to celebrate their rights, and it was the only appropriate time for such sentiment. The decreased number of federal troops in Norfolk were unable to fully contain and prevent the violence that these white civilians inflicted on the Black population. And this was compounded also by the local authorities, so the civil authorities, passivity to prevent any kind of violence against African Americans. So really, the defense of the city fell to the very small number of federal troops that remained in Norfolk, and that was only 200 in April of 1866, commanded by a captain named Philip Stanhope. All right, so what happened? I'll lay out the course of events here that the investigations proceedings kind of gleaned that about 800 African Americans paraded through town with about 20 newly discharged USCT soldiers who were dressed in their blue Union uniforms with their rifles to the speaker's stand. And just as these speeches were about to begin, a disturbance commenced at a nearby street corner. The president of the day's festivities was a man named Joseph Wilson, was on the stand when the disturbances began. And he observed that, quote, "I heard someone sing out there was a fight and heard some women scream, and looking around, I heard the report of a pistol. I heard several after that, and a short time afterwards, I saw a man running towards the house and the crowd after him." So it was pretty obvious from this testimony that the riot or the incident began with a gunshot, but very quickly, two different narratives emerged as to where that shot originated from. White civilians really advanced and pushed for this narrative that a group of young African American boys were playing with a pistol, and that's what set things off. Whereas Black civilians claimed that the first shot came from a white man who discharged his gun into the crowd on purpose. Joseph Wilson and others testified that a man named William Mosley, who was an off-duty police officer, seemed to be the likely perpetrator of the person who fired the first shot. This man was pretty drunk when the procession arrived at the speaker's stand, and he had already drawn considerable attention to himself, shouting vulgar remarks at African Americans as they made their way there. And so his presence, this man Mosley's drunken presence near the parade's end, he wasn't representing the city's police force, but instead was more of an agitator, really reflected this passivity of the civil authorities, their kind of seemingly unwillingness to prevent violence or at least give the impression they cared to prevent it, at all. And the civil authorities knew of this planned celebration by the city's blacks days in advance, but did nothing um, to prevent any kind of incident, even though they knew it had the potential to irritate the white population. Another potential person, instigator for this riot was another man named Robert Whitehurst, a white man who reportedly had a difficulty with some African Americans a few days prior, which prompted him in taking a pistol from his mother's house and arming himself. And so once the procession reached the stand, which was fairly close to his home, he approached the crowd with his pistol and, quote, met the same Negroes with whom he had had the difficulty a few days previous, and there resumed the quarrel. He shot into the crowd and took off running as a number of African Americans pursued him. And after this shot was fired, the inebriated police officer tried to arrest a black man who resisted the arrest. And that created another altercation as well. But Robert Whitehurst, from the crowd towards his house, just a few hundred yards away from the stand, and fired into the crowd again as they pursued him and tried to chase him down. When he reached the home, his mother appeared in the doorway, struggling to stop him from firing his gun further, but was unsuccessful. And in the middle of all of this panic and chaos, Whitehurst himself had been shot. And in an effort to return the fire, he accidentally shot his own mother in the throat. And though she lived to see her son die from his own injuries, she eventually succumbed to her mortal wound as well. So the United States federal troops that were stationed in Norfolk were alerted to this possibility of violence during the procession and began preparing for potential disturbances, unlike the local authorities. And Philip Stanhope, who was a captain in the 12th United States Infantry, he was stationed in Norfolk in command of the post there. Issued orders to his officers stating that on no account was anyone to leave their post unless they had written orders from him to that effect. Now, Stanhope is an interesting figure because his testimony makes up a lot of or is the longest and most comprehensive account of the occurrences that day. And so really his testimony is what helps to piece a lot of the kind of puzzle pieces together. He was privy to the beginning of the violence and stayed pretty much on the stand throughout most of the day as crowds dispersed. And shortly after the area had been cleared, he received word from the mayor of Norfolk, who frankly admitted that his forces, the civil authorities, were worthless and that he was not able to control the disturbance. Therefore, it was really up to the federal military to do something about it. Many people who testified to this inquiry board about what happened highlighted the inaction of the local law enforcement, saying that it was a general complaint the civil authorities didn't to do anything to quell the disturbance, and commented about how no one really, the unionists at least, those who remained loyal to the federal government during the war, didn't have any confidence in the civil authorities and the local leadership, because most of them are, quote, returned rebel soldiers. And so this unwillingness of the local authorities to try and maintain order and curb violence really, I think, is indicative of a larger climate in the South at the Civil War's end. You have all of these former Confederates returning home, maintaining this martial wartime mentality, kind of running up against these Union occupying forces who struggled to maintain order as their numbers continued to be reduced pretty drastically. Stanhope in Norfolk knew that his federal garrison really lacked sufficient manpower, and this presented for him at least a very real threat. And so as dusk approached, Stanhope prepared for potential outbursts throughout the night, really unsure of what was going to happen. He later testified that, quote, "In my opinion, on Monday night, an attempt was made to make an indiscriminate slaughter of the Negroes who were out on the streets, and I have not heard of one Negro being on the street who was not fired upon." As he returned to his quarters as night settled in, he came upon a crowd of white men dressed in gray. Okay, sorry about that. My Zoom had to update. um, so Stanhope, as he returned to his military quarters at night on 16th, saw a crowd of white men dressed in gray coming from the engine house. They were marching two and two and in step like any other organized body of men. So later that night, Stanhope had met with one of his officers when he learned of gunfire on the main streets. Promptly left to investigate, went towards the area, and in doing so, when he got closer to one of the main roads, he heard a body of men marching along the street, and very naturally assumed that these were some of his own night patrols trying to locate um, these gray these men wearing their gray uniforms. However, he was wrong. He actually encountered a very large body of former Confederate soldiers, all wearing their gray uniforms, about a body of 80 men. They were in three men apart, a short distance, marching by twos and in cadence step. As his orderly rode towards the rear of the group, a shot came from the head of the column, nearly struck Stanhope in the face. More shots were fired, at which point the entire body halted at the word of command, fronted the street. They wheeled around and fired a regular volley down one of the main streets. And so Stanhope, while he was obviously very disturbed by this occurrence, believed that because they were in a mass group, they could quickly be apprehended and stopped and restore peace to Norfolk. However, about 30 minutes after he deployed his own troops, they returned to headquarters saying that they couldn't find anyone. There were no organized bodies of men or collection of men on the streets. So how was this even possible? Where did they go? So Stanhope asserted that, quote, "This was sufficient evidence for me to conclude that it was not a mob, but an organized body of men who could meet and disperse at will. During the night, the patrols were actively engaged in patrolling the city, and although constant firing was going on during the whole night, and a number of Negroes were killed and wounded, not a single body of men could be encountered by my patrols, which I consider as another evidence they were not a mob, as a mob does not disperse immediately." So this encounter with this large group of men proved to be rather sobering experience for Stanhope, for he ordered out a company of men with specific orders to intercept and apprehend these rioters if they came across them. And if fired upon, they were ordered to exterminate the mob with the bayonet. Now, meanwhile, since local authorities weren't working to assist Stanhope, he sent a message to headquarters in Richmond, who responded to him, ordering him to continue their preventative actions as best as possible. And the report or the letter to him, "Instances occur or are in your judgment likely to occur, threatening violence to the colored people, you will interfere to suppress the whites." So it's pretty clear through this post-riot testimony that many Unionists, both white and black civilians in Norfolk, were very fearful of living in the city without the federal military present. One man remarked, quote, "I think that no Union man would be safe here without the military. And I know that these men here," meaning the Confederates or ex-Confederates, are more bitter than they were before General Lee surrendered. When they were pressed to kind of assess the effectiveness of the civil authorities, they warned that there was little confidence in the police and watchmen, most of whom are returned rebel soldiers. Um, Many of the witnesses that were interviewed were pressed as to what the status or the state of race relations were in Norfolk. One unionist, his name was Zachariah Sykes, responded, "Very bad indeed," almost immediately, and continued saying, "There would be no chance for the color either here. I know the people and their prejudices, and I know our only safety at the present time is unless we get some protection from the government, there is no safety for Union men." Another person echoed similar sentiments, stating that Union men were looked upon worse than dogs, and if the federal military were removed, there would be their lives would be unsafe, quote, in 10 minutes. Feel
I think we may have lost
okay.
you again, Brianna.
Should be back now, I think. Uh, okay,
Yes, you're
another
back.
Zoom update. Sorry about that. Um, and so just kind of wrap that up. So many of the union emphasized how they would not feel safe at all without the federal military present, and that they were necessary really to protect loyalists from full-scale violence from uh, these former Confederates. Now, the findings were reported to the Department of Virginia headquarters, again in Richmond, which really weaved together all of this testimony. Um, and 4 people were killed, 6 people, others were wounded. And the anniversary celebration of the Civil Rights Act on April 16th had excited considerable ill feeling among the white inhabitants of Norfolk. And despite the conflicting evidence and accounts of how things began, the board settled on the fact that the first shot was fired by a foolish prank of some young African American boys. But the board did acknowledge that the civil authorities in Norfolk were appallingly ill equipped to handle any form of violence against African Americans. And for that reason, the board noted the interests and peace and good order require that Norfolk should be held as a military post for some time to come. And so kind of in conclusion, I think this Norfolk incident really presents a unique, pretty fresh perspective on the intersections of post-war violence and military occupation, with a more focused attention on those who experienced it on the ground in these occupied cities. Um, this testimony really reveals how unionists, those loyal to the federal government, really made the case for a continued military presence in Norfolk by highlighting and emphasizing these defiant methods and war footing of these former Confederates. But ultimately, these arguments really fell short because Union troops continued to be rapidly demobilized and reduced, which provided the space and the opportunity for these ex-Confederates to lash out and reassert or try to reassert their pre-war supremacy and political power. And so the Norfolk riot and subsequent congressional inquiry really underscore how outnumbered these occupying forces were in the midst of such difficult hostiles. Um, and so the violence that really occurred on April 16th, 1866 in Norfolk was by no means the bloodiest conflict to occur during Reconstruction. There were many, many of those. And compared to later riots, it actually cost relatively few lives. But I think minimizing it in this way obscures the complexity and significance of the event and what it can offer to our understanding of occupation in the immediate post-war period. Um, Norfolk was a racially charged city from the time Union soldiers landed there in 1862 through the opening years of Reconstruction. Hostility towards African Americans only increased as the Civil War shifted from preserving the Union towards also a fight to end slavery. And with the passage of the Civil Rights Act on the heels of the 13th Amendment's ratification, ex-Confederates turned to paramilitary violence to preempt any kind of further change. So, given the recalcitrance of Southerners and the ineffectiveness of civil authorities, which was at best very passive, at worst hostile, the Union presence proved to be woefully inadequate in Norfolk. The rapid reduction of troops during demobilization created an opening that Southerners exploited to reassert their supremacy and to end Reconstruction before it had a chance to begin. And as one white unionist testified, quote, "I do not believe the colored people or the Union men would be safe a moment in Virginia after the military were removed. I think so from the events that have occurred in this place since the evacuation." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brianna. And if anybody has questions, you're more than welcome to use the chat feature and to type those in. So anyone with questions?
And hopefully that wasn't too choppy for everybody. I know technology can be challenging sometimes.
All right, so no questions? I kind of have one for you, and I hope you didn't address this at the beginning, and I hope I didn't miss it. But the African American population in Norfolk, how did that kind of compare to like the white population, and how does it compare to other cities in Virginia?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd have to shape up on my numbers, but I think there was a significant population of book. I'm not sure. I want to say it was probably somewhere between 10 to 20% of the entire city's population. I'd have to double check on that. Um, and so it wasn't one of the largest. I know Richmond had a significantly large population of African Americans in the South. I don't think Norfolk was necessarily on that scale, but there was a huge influx of African Americans during the war itself, which really ballooned the population numbers. Um, Compared to the unionist population, so white unionists, those who remained loyal to the federal government, which was, I think, fairly small in Norfolk, or at least evidence of them is relatively small. Together, they probably constituted, roughly 40% of the population. That's a rough guess, but so not the biggest, but not the smallest either.
And do you think that had any bearing on the
A
violence?
couple questions. What record groups contain the courts and the congressional investigation? It was actually it's founded. It's bearing on the violence. I think so. The larger numbers and the bigger population, I'm sure, irritated a lot of people when they returned home after the war to a city that had whose demographics were probably very different from when they initially left for service at the beginning of the war. So I'd say yes. Which record groups contain the congressional investigation? It's actually a House bill. I think it's number 72 from 1866. So I did not find it in a particular record group. I just found it through the congressional records online. Founding of the plan. The following year, yet another manifestation of this anti-black tolerance. Um, Yes, I'm not an expert on the formation of the Klan, but I would absolutely say that um, their formation was, again, just another way to resist these changes that were being implemented by the federal government. And in 1867, you have this shift from presidential Reconstruction led by Andrew Johnson to Congress, the radical Republicans really taking over, which was a much heavier hand, dividing the South up into military districts, requiring a much higher percentage of loyalty oaths. Any kind of real progress could be made. So I'm sure a lot of that factored into the Klan's formation. All right. Once radical reconstruction began, was the military presence in Norfolk increased? That's a great question. How effective was this in preventing further violence? Um, that's a good question. I do not know. I would imagine that it maybe increased slightly, but not a whole lot. That's a very good question. How effective would that be in preventing further incidents of violence? Hopefully, it would be effective. I would think that by buttressing the federal military presence with more troops, that they would be better able um, to kind of prevent any kind of outburst. I don't know of any subsequent events of violence on the scale of the 1866 riot in Norfolk, which again was pretty small, but still, I think the context of it is really what makes it very important. Um, had lynchings started as early as 1865? I don't know for certain, though I would imagine so, but I can't say with any kind of certainty about that. Um, Question about the identity of the organized Confederates, the unit to which they belong. That's from John Koski. Um, that's a really good question. In the testimony itself, it referred to these men as kind of being stationed. The name of it is escaping me. Drury's Bluff, right outside of Richmond, for most of the war, but the unit that they belonged to was an artillery unit, and there's some evidence to suggest that they were attached to the Army of Northern Virginia at other points during the war, and they might have seen some kind of combat in Fredericksburg, I believe, and possibly also Gettysburg. So I have a sense of who they were and where they might have fought, but that's part of the dissertation research that's ongoing, trying to figure out who they were and where they came from, and really where their service took them. Leslie points out Cassandra Newby Alexander's dissertation. Absolutely, that's a great piece of work. I highly recommend it. I've referenced it as well. Following 1877, was there a sharp rise in racial incidents in Norfolk? Another great question. Unfortunately, that's a little out of the scope of my research, and so that's a great question, something that I probably will eventually look into, but at the current time, am not so sure. But 1877, the troops were fully removed from the South as part of that agreement to elect the new president. And so I'm sure that there was, whether in Norfolk or at various other places throughout Virginia, there was probably some level of increase in racial incidents. Did you note any organized Black resistance to white violence? Great question. My research, as of right now, has not revealed any of that, though I'm sure there was some. Norfolk really had a very strong, very well-organized political Black community who was very active in advocating for Black rights. Joseph T. Wilson, I think I mentioned, was one of the big proponents of that. And so they stayed politically active throughout Reconstruction. And so that, you could kind of posit that as resistance to white violence, politically speaking, trying to secure those rights. In terms of other kinds of organized resistance, I haven't stumbled across anything quite yet, but I hope to.
All right. Any final questions? Going once, going twice. Well, thank you very much, Brianna, for that excellent presentation. And thank you to those of you who tuned in and joined us tonight. And let's see, there's something that came up in the chat. Let's see. Do you want to take that one? I think that is a question.
Sure. Let's see. I think that their post-war violence was a continuation rather than degeneration from the wartime conduct. Let's see. That's a great question, and I probably will fall back on one of this excellent book called After Appomattox by Gregory Downes, which is just phenomenal, I think. He essentially says that, or makes the argument that 1865 is just one step in surrender. It's only the military surrenders. And so we really need to look at the early years of Reconstruction as just a continuation of wartime, because there was a continuation of violence from Southerners, from ex-Confederates who were trying to resist a lot of the change. And so in that sense, yes, I think that is a continuation of their wartime service versus a degeneration of it. But that's a good question, good food for thought as I continue pressing forward with my own research.
All right. And oh, was there one more?
One more, yeah. Carpetbaggers in Norfolk during the immediate post-war years. Great question that I don't have an answer to quite yet. I would imagine that there was some level of that. I know Norfolk, even during the war, maintained some of its economic ties to the North. So I would imagine that that also those Northerners might have swooped down during the Reconstruction years. But I don't know quite yet. And again, hopefully we'll find out in the near future.
Well, thank you very much, Brianna. Thank you all for tuning in and coming up with some great questions. And please continue to support the museum and continue to register for our programs. And you can always visit our website at acwm.org. Good night, everyone.